Well, in this lesson, we're going to learn about how to create vector graphics using a software package called Inkscape. To get started, we are going to do a little starter where I want you to think about how could you draw a robot if you are only drawing with squares and rectangles. Okay, pause the video in a moment, go away, grab a piece of paper and a pencil, no more than 5 minutes. Can you create an outline of a shape just using squares and rectangles that looks like a robot? You can save the robot that you have created now, and we will use this towards the end of the lesson. What are we going to do then? Well, first of all, we are going to learn a little bit about what vector graphics are. Essentially, the vector graphics are made up of what we call paths, which are just lines connected together to make different shapes. They're very easy to create with vector graphic packages, and you've got some properties that we are able to change with these. One of them is the fill. So in this case here, this triangle has a grey fill, and the second is the stroke. The path sort of follows, and in this case, it's a solid black line. And using these, we can kind of create other sort of shapes such as circles and polygons. And by combining lots of these, we can make some very effective vector graphics. Okay, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to learn how to draw some of the basic shapes, rectangles, ellipses, polygons, stars, with all of the different properties of their fills and strokes and some shape-specific attributes, sort of rounded corners and things like that. We're also going to use to sort of see how you can manipulate these on a page, sort of selecting them and moving and resizing, rotating and flipping them, etc., all on the page. The idea is that we're going to use Inkscape for the package to create our images that should be installed on your computer. So we'll need to start that up in a few minutes. We're going to use worksheets that come along with this video. However, if you just watch the video, hopefully you'll be able to sort of do it without needing to refer to the worksheets if you watch closely. To begin with, what we're going to do is we're going to create some rectangles, a couple of rectangles there, one with no stroke, one with a stroke that is dashed and got a blue fill, and some rounded rectangles. And what you're going to do is you are going to put these pictures into a workbook in Teams that you should have access to, like here. So this is where you're going to put the images once you've created them in Teams. So let's get started. I'm going to switch over to Inkscape now. I'm going to show you how you would do these, and then I'd like you to pause the video and do the same. Okay, when we open up Inkscape, if you've never used it before, you will probably have been asked to make a few choices about some settings. If you just leave everything as they are as the default and click through to allow the application to start, you will be presented with a screen that looks something similar to this. Bunch of toolbars down the side here that on the left hand side that give us some of the drawing tools. Over here we've got some more advanced kind of options and things, and along the top we have an area where, depending on what tool we're on, we will see sort of slightly different options depending on the tool. The middle is obviously where we will create our drawings. At the moment it's kind of zoomed in quite a bit. If you use the plus and the minus keys on the keyboard, you can zoom in and out to get to see the whole page. So the first thing we're going to do is draw a rectangle. So that's obviously over here using the rectangle tool. So I'm going to select the rectangle tool, and I'm going to draw a rectangle. Now, depending on what you last drew with Inkscape, will depend on the color scheme of the fill, the bit in the middle, and the color of the stroke around the edges that you get. The quickest way, if you wish to change some of these, is if you go down to the bottom here, where this long color palette is along the bottom. When you've got an object selected, i.e. you've got grab sort of handles around the edges, by simply clicking in these, that will allow you to change the fill color for the object. If you want to change the stroke, in this case at the moment it's the black line around the edges, then what you do is you do the same, but if you hold down the shift key when you do this, then that will change the colour of the stroke. If you find you need to go in and change some of the options for the shapes, so for example, here I might want to change the width of the stroke. I can right click and go on to where it says fill and stroke. And this is going to bring up a panel over here. We've got some sub panels on here that will allow us to choose between the fill and the stroke, and then some options to do with the stroke style. So what I think I'd like to do is I'd like to increase the size of the stroke to make it a little bit larger. And on here, I'm going to show you how you can change some of the options of the stroke, perhaps making dashed lines. By default, when you first draw an object like a rectangle, the grab handles that you get around the edges, I find it a little bit distracting. I'm going to go back to a different thing. So here you'll see we've got white dots. They are the default settings for a particular kind of shape, and we can go in here and we can use these to sort of change the sizes of our shape a little bit if we want. But this one here, the rounded one for a rectangle, what that lets us do is actually go in and choose if we want to have rounded rectangles or not, on the rounded corners on our rectangles. So that's something you might want to do. That's the first mode where we're seeing these white dots, the attributes for a particular shape. If I now choose the select tool, you'll see the grab handles change to be these black arrows. These ones give us some more choices about changing the height, the width, and the general size of the object that we've got selected. If at this point you then again left click on the mouse button, you'll see that those grab handles change in shape a little bit, and these change to allow us to do rotation of our object or to skew the object, so we can get different kind of effects like so with our object. Notice if I was to draw another rectangle, it's going to come with the same properties as the last one that I drew. It remembers what properties we were using last. So it may be that we don't want to have rounded rectangle corners, and perhaps we want to have a different fill. Holding down the shift key, maybe a different stroke. There's also other options on here about how the corners and things will look, but we'll maybe look at some of those in a bit more detail later. So for now, I'm going to ask you to pause the video, and what I'd like you to do is go to the workbook that you have in Teams and see if you can complete the first task, the A2 task, creating a green rectangle, creating a blue rounded edge rectangle with 2.5mm dotted green stroke. Okay, next we're going to move on to using the ellipse tool, and the idea is we're going to draw some ellipses. We're going to find out how to change the fill and the stroke again, same actually as we did before. Look at how we can adjust some of the properties, the height and the width, how we can actually manipulate our circle to create segments and arcs. So once again, I am going to switch to my Inkscape. I am going to use the black select tool up here to sort of click on the different objects we've got, and I'm going to delete these by clicking on them one at a time and remove those. So next I'm going to switch to my ellipse tool, and again it's when I draw an ellipse it is going to have remembered the properties of the last ellipse that I drew. Now funnily enough, the last ellipse I drew had very strange properties looking at it here, but what I can do is I can reset those by choosing here that I want to be doing a full ellipse. This is the shape that I kind of must have drawn last, I'm not sure why. But what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to go in and I'm going to change some of the properties, just like we did with the rectangle. I'm going to bring the width of the stroke down to 3. I'm going to use these grab handles to change the size of them. Notice I can change the height and the width here. And obviously at the moment, if I was to click on here, the skewing would sort of happen if I was to rotate it, because it's not a perfect sort of circle that I've got there. A note about these, the choices of which handles you've got here. So I've got the black tool selected here. When I click once, it switches to the rotation and the skewing. Okay, so I'd be able to skew my sort of ellipse if I wanted. If I double click, it'll actually bring me to here, which is the object specific attributes. And this is where I'm able to do things like make arcs and segments. If I put the cursor over this rounded dot, like I did with the rounded, to make rounded corners on the rectangle, what will I do? Now there's two things going to happen. In this case, because the mouse is outside of my ellipse, what it is doing, we're getting this kind of Pac-Man effect. But if I was to move the mouse cursor inside of the circle, then we get the difference. We get these kind of segments that we're sort of creating here, like so. Obviously, if I was to draw another ellipse now, it's going to, like we saw earlier, it's going to use the same properties I had previously. If you want to change from doing arcs to segments, you can click here. Sorry, if you want to change back to being a full circle, you can click there, and that will give you those sort of properties again. Let's bring that down to a sensible size. Okay, so if you could then go back to your workbook, pause the video in a moment, and go on to the next slide and create a red ellipse with a blue stroke, create a pink arc with a red stroke, and copy and paste your images into here in your workbook. Next, we're going to learn how to create and manipulate polygons. Polygons being a shape with multiple sides to it. We're going to learn how to create one. Again, we'll be able to change the fill and the stroke of these, but we'll also be able to change the number of corners, the number of sides, and look at some of the properties such as adding rounded corners to our polygons. Okay, once again, I am going to switch to Inkscape. And here in Inkscape, you'll see underneath the rectangle, ellipse and circle tool, we've got the polygon and star tool. So if I click on that one, by default, it's again going to pick up the last options I had. Now, interestingly, though I want a polygon, I must have been drawing some stars recently. So that's the first thing that is going to be drawn in this case. But this tool is really a two-in-one up here, and what we do is we can swap between them, between polygons and being stars. We're just going to look at polygons first of all, so I am going to use my select tool to select the polygon, and I am going to go and move the polygon into the middle. Once again, we are going to look at using the fill tool. I can go down the bottom and choose things, but why not for a change? I will go here and use some of the color selection tools on here to maybe change the colors now. So I can go around the wheel to get the general color and then move inside to get more specific kind of colors with this. If I wanted to, there's also a color picker tool down here, and I can kind of pick somewhere on the screen. If I had another picture or something that I was wanting to sort of pick the color of, I could kind of go off and sort of pick colors, or if I had a different shape perhaps, I could pick colors with that. We can also go in and we can change things to do with the fill. We can change its, the stroke. We can change its size, and I could change the color of it here. We're using the wheel again, or I could go to the bottom and I could use the shift tool to change the colors at the bottom as we did before. If I go back to the select tool now, so once again, obviously we have the same resizing options. I click one more time and I get my skewing and my rotation tools, and again, if I double click on the shape, I get the shape specific tools here, and these are some of the things that we've got. So if I grab that one, you can see I can sort of essentially do some rotating and things with it. But what else could we do? Well, we can change the number of corners. This time we're going to use the toolbar to do some of these. So if I wanted it to be a hexagon, I can do that, and all the way up to an octagon, back to a pentagon. And I can change the roundness of the corners as well. So watch what happens here. If I click on here, the corners start to become rounded. And eventually, when they get so rounded that they get larger than the length of the sides, we start to get some strange kind of effects appearing there, which can be useful. And likewise, if we go the other way and we go into negative values for this, then we can again get some other sort of strange effects that we might use in our images. I'm going to reset that roundness back to 0, and I'm going to like so. Okay, what I'd like you to do next is to go to your workbook again. I'm going to have a little look. This time we are being asked to create a purple polygon with 3 points and a green stroke. Create a yellow polygon with 7 rounded corners and a 1.5mm dotted stroke. So once again, if I can ask you to pause the video, go back to Inkscape, create your images and paste screenshots of them into the workbook here. One last couple of little things to show you before we move on to creating our robot. We should have all of the skills now for rectangles and different shapes to be able to create it. It's just a couple of things about how you might move shapes around, how you might duplicate them and resize and rotate them. And also alter what we call the Z order of the shape, how they are sort of placed onto the drawing canvas and which shapes appear on top of each other, etc. I'll just switch over to Inkscape and show you what I mean. So here I have a shape that we had earlier. I can click on the black select tool as we've seen before, and I can choose a shape and move it around and resize them. Clicking again on the shape will give us our rotation tools, which we've already seen. But what happens when we get multiple sort of shapes on top of our canvas? Here actually another useful thing maybe, can you notice that we can see some of this shape through the other one? That's because the shape has its fill has not got is not 100% transparent. So what I'm going to do is change the opacity of it so that it doesn't kind of allow other shapes to come through. So depending on what you're doing, you might kind of want to go down there. Can you see I'm on the fill here and I'm changing its opacity to change if we can see through the images or not. But as we can see, what's happened here when the second shape that I've drawn is on top of the first shape. Perhaps we don't want that. Perhaps we want the shape the other way to be the other way around. What you'll see is at the top here, when I've got a shape selected, whichever one it is, I'm able to move the object up and down a kind of stack. So in this case, the one I want to move is perhaps at the top. So I want to move it all of the way to the bottom or just sort of down one layer in the stack. So every time we draw something, it kind of adds another sort of part onto the stack. So here we've got sort of 3 items. Let's see if I can move this one in between the middle now. So by moving down one, you can see it is behind the rectangle, but in front of the polygon. And we can just sort of choose whichever shape we want using the select tool here and manipulate the sort of levels that they are at. I might put that one down one and then put it all the way to the back like so. Okay, that's how we reorder the Z level for our shapes. Switch back to the PowerPoint now and discuss what it is we're going to do to. So what I'd like you to do for the remainder of the lesson is go back to the robot you drew at the beginning of the lesson as the starter, and see if you can create that, recreate that image. If it's too simple or you want to try some different effects, maybe have a little look at some images online of robots to try and get some different ideas. But try and use as many of the tools as you can. Start just using the rectangles, but then try and maybe advance on to using circles and things. Look at some of the effects we can see here by putting one circle inside of another to make eyes and things like that here. Okay, and then once you have created your robot, moving on to this slide here, and put in some pictures of your robots that you've kind of created. If you do actually have enough time at the end, you could kind of go back and use the star tool, which I showed you with the polygon tool, and have a little play around with the star tool. But for now, the main objective would be to finishing off and creating our robot today. Thanks very much for watching. I hope you've learned lots about Inkscape. Goodbye for now.